Okay. You have no desire to introduce me, right? I can just introduce myself.
Well, I can introduce you if you'd like me to.
That's okay. I get
But I'll just let you take the reins.
Thank you. I never know what to do with myself when people are talking about me. So,
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Amy Jacobson. I'm a licensed social worker. I work for a private nonprofit in Bismarck called YouthWorks, but my role as human trafficking navigator is through the statewide human trafficking task force. And Sergeant Bomey actually just texted me there's a situation that he needs to step away and take care of. So it's the nature of being in law enforcement, I would guess. So the training today is going to be focused on sort of two things. It's introductory, what is human trafficking and what does it look like in North Dakota? And then also diving a little bit deeper into like the trauma associated with individuals who've experienced trafficking, maybe make some sense out of if you've had tenants or clients that you're working with who've been trafficked, some of their behavior can be extreme. So I'm going to start my screen share. I do not have COVID. Just have a dry throat. So I would like to know, though, I think it might be easier who has not had training on trafficking. Maybe type that in the chat box, just so I get a sense of what folks already know. All right, is that working for everybody? Everybody can see it? Okay, my partner who stepped away, his name is Mike Bomey. He's a sergeant with the Bismarck Police Department, and he is on our human trafficking multidisciplinary team that we have in Bismarck, and we are part of what's called a response team. So when a victim is identified, we are sort of the first point of contact, along with an advocate with the Abused Adult Resource Center in Bismarck, as well as a youth advocate from YouthWorks. So, yeah, the other thing.
I'm actually back, Amy. So.
Okay, look at you. All right. Is there anything you want to say about yourself?
Nope.
Okay. Just a heads up, there's no way to do a training on human trafficking without talking about trauma. I try not to do too much, I guess, inflicting trauma on you, but I do think it's important that you have an understanding of the extent of the trauma that the clients that we work with have. So it's graphic. I talk about sex. I try not to swear, but I sometimes am not successful at that. But I oftentimes, if I'm like relaying something that a client has said, sometimes I will say exactly what they said, just so you sort of can enter into what their experience was. So I'm going to do a little quiz. I do not expect that you will answer this when there's so many people, but true or false, most prostitutes are willing participants. So at this point in the anti-trafficking efforts that we've made in North Dakota, I would say for the most part, people tend to say no, they're not. They believe that they're not. I think the interesting thing about that is every prostitute, when I say prostitute, I want you to imagine air quotes, because in the years that I've been doing this, I've only worked with one person who was in business for themselves. Every other prostitute that I worked with was actually a human trafficking victim. So every woman that I have worked with that has been trafficked into prostitution believes that they are a willing victim, that they are like a bad person, and they see themselves more as a criminal. It's one of the reasons why it's a very different dynamic than working with a domestic violence victim. True or false, in North Dakota, children can be prosecuted or adjudicated delinquent for prostitution. I know it's really counterintuitive, but up until 2015, children could be adjudicated delinquent for the crime of prostitution, which, you know, makes no sense for those of us who understand that children can't consent to having sex with adults. And so they certainly can't consent to being prostituted. And we'll talk more about what it actually looks like, sex trafficking of juveniles in North Dakota, as we go along. Also, true or false, is human trafficking prosecuted only at a federal level? So North Dakota has a human trafficking specific law. So human trafficking can be prosecuted at a local level, at a federal level, and also for some tribes at a tribal level. Although, as far as I understand, 3 Affiliated is the only tribe that actually has a law regarding human trafficking. Mike, is there anything you'd want to say about this?
It's not that they won't prosecute these cases at the local level, but we just, most of the time, especially the way our state is set up right now, we get more bang for the buck at the federal level. There's more truth in sentencing. They have to do 85% of their sentence. We just feel like sentencing wise, we get more bang for the buck. And I used to say that I don't remember one ever going through state court, but we actually have one so far that's going through state court right now. And those of you who are from Bismarck, that's the Hong Kong spa case. Some of you might have saw it in the news. So far that one is state level, but the feds are looking at it. So I don't know where that's going to go.
Yeah, my preference, even though I have great respect and admiration for our local state's attorney, she's really, really good. I like them to be sentenced for long sentences. So, and for them to have to do the percentage that they have to. So.
Yeah, it's not the prosecutor's fault. It's just the way that the state is, the politics are swinging in the state right now. So that's not a political statement, by the way. I'm just telling you the facts.
Okay, so true or false, all participants involved in human trafficking are criminals. So this is where it gets really tricky, because if you have, and for law enforcement in particular, this is a dilemma, and Mike and I have worked together for, I don't know, 4 years, something like that. And you know, one of the beautiful things and challenging things about working as a multidisciplinary team is that you have to figure out how to work well with somebody who has a different primary goal than you do, right? So my primary goal is that my client or other people's clients are intervened with in a victim-centered way, right? Mike's goal, if I may be so bold, Mike, I think your goal is an investigation and ultimately prosecution of the perpetrator.
Correct.
Your secondary goal, I know that it's important to you that they get treatment. And it's very important to me that the perpetrator be investigated and prosecuted, but we have different goals. But one of the things that's been challenging, especially in the earlier days, is so for those victims who are involved in drugs as well. So say Mike gets a call, or his patrol guys get a call from a hotel saying, there's somebody here. Mike, I think I'm going to have you, because I'm going to mess it up if I try to talk like how a cop.
So the potential conflict with the goals is a lot of times we'll get called to hotels or other like a residence or something for a report of somebody engaging in prostitution. So we, as the police, have a duty to that caller or that hotel manager especially to come in and try to take care of that problem, right? Because we serve the public. So in the past, and I'm very glad to say that things are changing on how we handle stuff, or things have changed. When I was a young patrolman, we would go there, hopefully develop probable cause, either knock on the door or get a search warrant for the room, hit it, and ultimately the woman engaging in those activities would probably be going to jail for some kind of drug we found in the room, or even just be misdemeanor prostitution, a local charge here. Now, because of our team approach, and we did that in the past because we saw it as our duty to whoever made that phone call, right? So I like this team approach that our team uses, and I think we're doing things the right way. When we knock on that door at that hotel room now, law enforcement's primary goal is to get that woman some help, get her into, start her down that road of getting out of that life. Because what are we solving by throwing her in jail? We're getting her out of that hotel, right? And we've made that hotel manager or whoever happy. But we can make them just as happy by getting her out of there, getting her in a shelter, and hopefully getting her started on the road to not engage in those activities anymore. So it's tough working as a team with different goals, but really, if you look at it, we're all trying to do the right thing. And it doesn't take long before you can see that the way we're doing things now is doing the right thing.
I agree. Of course, I agree with that. What I observe working with law enforcement in these situations where the most frustrating thing that I see for law enforcement is when they are called to respond to something and a victim is there. They know that that person is a victim of human trafficking, but they are not disclosing that. They almost never disclose that to law enforcement right away. And they are not interested in arresting them for prostitution. And so they connect them with services, but oftentimes those people choose not to. And for law enforcement, it's really difficult, I think, to walk away from that situation, knowing that that person is going back to somebody who is abusing them. So,
but we also look at it like kind of carrot and stick. The carrot for them is to, if they go into those services and basically take Amy's help, then we don't have to use the stick of throwing them in jail. But just them knowing that we could potentially charge them with prostitution sometimes is enough to even just get them started cooperating. They may disappear the next day, but from our perspective, it's still a win.
So I'm the carrot.
You are the carrot, I am the stick.
Yes, I would rather be the brownie. I think it should be like the brownie or the stick. Who wants a carrot? I mean, good people want carrots, I suppose. Okay, so this is the federal law. This was the law that sort of our state law was modeled after, and it was called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000. I'm going to do this instead because I think that it's easier to understand. So basically, when we are looking to see if something is a trafficking case, right, it has to fit these three elements. So there has to be the process, the means, and the end. So the process is what is happening, right? So are they recruiting somebody? Are they harboring somebody, moving somebody, obtaining, maintaining? The means is by force, fraud, or coercion. And the end is for involuntary servitude or debt bondage or slavery or sex trade. So keep in mind that if we're talking about a juvenile, you don't have to show the means. It doesn't matter how they are having this individual be trafficked. They can't consent, so it doesn't matter. That matters when they're 18 or over. I will say that what we see is it's never one, like force or fraud or coercion. It's a combination of all three pretty much all the time. And Mike, I like what you say about if you try to just keep somebody with force, that doesn't work. There's a reason why it's fraud and coercion. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if I have to force somebody to do something, that means I constantly have to stay on top of them. It's almost like trying to keep a prisoner, right? But there's something about mentally and emotionally manipulating somebody into doing what you want that is far more powerful. And that's part of the problem of working these cases too, is trying to get these victims away from that powerful hold that they have on the victims.
Thank you.
It's a little bit like supervising police officers. It's much easier to get them to think they want to do it than to force them to do it.
Supervising anybody, probably.
Yes.
We do have a question.
Yeah, yay, thank you.
Can you clarify the difference between prostitution and human trafficking, and how do they identify which is actually going on?
So that is an excellent question, and that is like the purpose of this whole training. So way to cut to the chase. Yes, I can. What I will say is it's rare in my experience to work with somebody who is a prostitute. That is the common understanding of prostitution, which is a woman who wants to do that, who engages in that willingly. It's her idea. It's what she wants to do, and she's in business for herself. Almost without exception, like out of all of the people that I have worked with for the past 5 years, which are the hundreds, right? There was only one woman who was in business for herself. Every other prostitute that we've come into contact with is a victim of sex trafficking. So how I usually say it is they were trafficked into prostitution. People's belief about prostitution is mistaken. The belief that prostitution is just a business that women want to engage in is wrong, quite frankly. So I hope that answered some of it. Did I miss part of the question, Kylie?
It was kind of a two-part question. The difference between, and then how do they identify which is actually going on?
Right. And so we'll get into that more, but the short answer is they identify typically as a criminal. They don't identify as a victim. They don't identify as somebody who's being manipulated or coerced. They see themselves as a bad person. So the federal law, the part of the law that I really want to focus on as it applies to youth is, so sex trafficking is all those things, right? Recruitment, harboring, transporting, patronizing. So patronizing is like patronizing a business, right? You're giving somebody your business. So if you are an adult and you are having sex with a juvenile in exchange for something, right? It's a clear exchange. Like, I will give you a place to stay if you have sex with me. That is trafficking. It's what we call non-third party trafficking. So under the federal law, that is trafficking, which is very difficult for people. It probably took me 2 years of doing this work to really get that that was trafficking. So here's an easier way to think about it. So commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC, this is the equation. If you have a minor and there is commercial sex, which is to say somebody is having sex with them in exchange for anything of value, right? Doesn't matter whether it's a place to stay, it's drugs, money, whatever, that juvenile is a victim of human trafficking. And the person who is having sex with them in exchange for something is the trafficker. It's very rarely prosecuted that way. And Mike and I can go around and around about that. We've got like I don't think we do actually have a difference of opinion, Mike. I just think I'm more of a zealot about it than you are. And you're more of a pragmatist. Pragmatist? Is that the word?
Well, I can see the prosecution side. You just refuse to see anybody's side but your own.
That's not true. That's totally not true. I mean, maybe it's a little true. So they're usually prosecuted as like a gross sexual imposition because it's more difficult to show. Like, remember when I said that it took me a couple of years to really get that that's trafficking? I think prosecution is concerned that a jury would have the same difficulty with it. Whereas if it's GSI, if it's a gross sexual imposition, that victim gets some measure of justice versus kind of rolling the dice. And I do understand that, but somebody had to prosecute the first human trafficking case where a woman was trafficked into prostitution. That's all I'll say about that, Michael. I won't argue with you anymore.
Oh, so we're done arguing.
Yeah, mostly because I don't want to hear what you have to say. So this is the North Dakota law. It's called the Uniform Act on Prevention of and Remedies for Human Trafficking. So we had a human trafficking law prior to 2015, but it was not robust, would be a kind way of saying it. So this was the updates to that existing law. So safe harbor was one of the things that we were able to pass, which is decriminalization for minor victims. So basically, if you are a minor and you are being trafficked, You are seen as a deprived child, like a child who has been abused or neglected versus a delinquent child. Expungement or vacature. So if you are a victim of human trafficking and you have convictions on your record that happened while you were under pimp control or being trafficked, you can maybe get those vacated. Sentencing enhancements. So prior to 2015, so pimping is trafficking. Like there's no way around that. And so prior to 2015, trafficking, if somebody into prostitution, was an A misdemeanor. And as we talk more about what that experience is like for these women, I think you'll be as outraged as I was when I learned that. It is now a C felony. And if you have trafficked a juvenile, that is an A felony. So victim ID protection, mandated law enforcement assistance for international victims. So we work really closely with Homeland Security because a lot of foreign national folks, even though they come over on a legitimate visa, they're really vulnerable to being trafficked. And
I don't know what that guy's name is from the PD, but he was.
So somebody is not muted. Anyway, so they're extraordinarily vulnerable to that. So the other thing that was under that law is the formation of an offender program or a John school. Mike, can you just quickly sort of run through what that is?
Yep. So one of the reasons I really like our team approach is that we go at it holistically and that we try to address, I guess, all the problems involved in human trafficking. And one of those problems is men's mentality about prostitution. It doesn't look like I have a lot of men in the audience, but if any of you have ever been in a men's locker room, you know what I'm talking about. We're really flippant about it. And I think there's this attitude among men, most men, that it's just a business transaction. But once you start dealing with these women and realizing what they go through, it changes your mind. And that's what that offender, the demand reduction program, we call it, that is specifically addressing the demand portion of it. So that hopefully, and it's basically consisting of the classroom consists of men who have been caught when we do John stings. We call them John stings. I don't know what you want to call them now, Amy, but those are those men. And basically we're just trying to change that mindset. And I wish all of you could sit in on the class and just see that the difference that it makes with those men, because most men locally here or in North Dakota that go to see a prostitute are not there to harm that woman. Most of them are they're not mean-spirited or anything like that. But this class helps to change their mind about what they think is a harmless activity.
Yeah, so you probably can tell Mike and I, we work really closely together and we're really close partners, but we like give each other heck a lot. But one of the first, and I think it was like maybe the second time I'd met Mike, we had a pretty serious difference of opinion. And I like props to him because he was in a room full of women and he was talking about, so when they do those John stings or when they arrest somebody for that, the concern that he has for those men, right? That like, if ever he's worried about somebody committing suicide after that, it's them. And of course, like the whole room full of women were like, oh, cry me a river, right? Like, we were not good partners to him that day. But my opinion or my sort of thought about people who are buyers has changed dramatically. I was real judgy of them. I am not saying that they are wonderful people. I'm not saying that what they're doing is right, but it's complex. And after doing the demand reduction program, I can tell you that the men that we have had contact with excuse me, they don't know. Like they don't know what's underneath all of it. And once they know, they're really horrified for the most part. I'm sure there's dirtbags out there who just do it so they can get by with hurting people.
Amy, we have a question here from Vicky. Does a man who is caught get prosecuted? And if so, is it a misdemeanor or a felony? The Johns get prosecuted under B misdemeanor. It's a city municipal court charge. So it's a B misdemeanor.
There's a couple other questions too.
Yeah.
I'm seeing them. Vicky, also the question about, sorry, if a landlord tells the tenant that they will have, they can forego the rent. I think that could come under sexual servitude. Because there's in North Dakota, like there's extenuating circumstances. So like if it's January and they have no place to go and they're saying you're going to be homeless if you don't do this. I mean, I'm not law enforcement, I'm not a prosecutor, but I think that might fit sexual servitude. And then the question about men that are trafficked. So yes, I talk way more about females that are trafficked because I've worked with more. Like, I should at some point, like, look at the data and how many people I have intervened with. I know it's in the hundreds, but only 2 of the sex trafficking victims were male. But labor trafficking, there's more more male victims in labor trafficking. Men who are trafficked into prostitution, it's complicated. The reason we don't identify that so much is it's complicated. One, it's really hidden. That's much more underground. And men are more ashamed. It's more, I shouldn't say it's more difficult, but there's a whole other layer of, in our culture, men are not supposed to be victims. Right? They're supposed to be strong and they're supposed to be like in charge of things and certainly not supposed to be victims of sexual abuse. So, and for anybody who's worked with children who are victims of sexual abuse, it's the same thing with boys. So the interesting thing is the men that are trafficked into prostitution, my experience, their buyers are also men. Okay, so some stereotypes. One of the biggest stereotypes when I first started doing this is that the victims are kidnapped. So I remember like the first, I think 6 months that I did this work, there was actually a church in Bismarck that had printed out a bunch of like pamphlets, and I have great respect for what they were trying to do, but it really speaks to the ignorance that people had about the reality of trafficking. So they had like brochures that they would give kids, and it basically was like, be careful of strangers, right? Like stranger danger, which we all know now, even with childhood sexual abuse, it's more likely to be somebody who knows them versus somebody who abducts them. And then one of the things that it said is, if somebody tries to do that, tell your parents, you can trust them, they love you. Well, for me, a lot of the juveniles that I've worked with, they can't trust their parents. And yeah, their parents might love them, but it doesn't look like a movie where kids are being kidnapped. It just doesn't. It's more complicated than that. All pimps are male. I will tell you that overwhelmingly, the pimps that I have not worked with them. That's not the right way to put it, but I have worked with their victims. They are males. Oftentimes there will be a female who is involved in the trafficking, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another stereotype, to your point, that only girls and women, not true. Men are. It's just harder to identify. A stereotype is that commercial sex is a victimless crime. And so when I say commercial sex, that includes pornography. And I'm not trying to rain on pornography parade, but for the women that I work with, being trafficked into pornography is one of the most difficult things for them. It's the one that sticks with them because they have no control over who's watching them, when they're watching them. There was a study that showed a statistical significant level of dissociation. So that's like a scientific way of saying, so if you talk about a statistical significant, that means that like pay attention to this, right? This is an anomaly. This is something to pay attention to. So a statistically significant level of dissociation among women who were trafficked into prostitution or into pornography. So dissociation is your body's way, your mind's way of protecting you from something that exceeds your ability to cope, right? So for women who are being trafficked into pornography, think about what they're being asked to do or told to do. They have to be having sex with somebody that they didn't necessarily choose to have sex with. They have to pretend that it's like the best sex ever, right? And it's being filmed. They're aware that it's being filmed, so they're acting as well, and they know that they have no control over who's going to watch it. So, I mean, the thing that I would say about pornography is you don't know. You don't know if what you are watching is a woman being raped and being victimized. And I personally don't think that any pleasure I would get out of watching porn would be worth that, if that makes sense. Anything you want to say about that, Mike?
No, I think you covered it.
Another stereotype is that they choose to enter the sex trade. So what I will say is for the majority of them, they choose to enter into a relationship with somebody they think loves them. And, you know, I even feel like it's disrespectful to say that they think they love them. It feels very real, right? And they are choosing to be in a relationship with somebody who loves them and they love that person. It's not usually at the very beginning of the relationship. It's not like the cards are all on the table, right? It's like, hey, you know, you want to go out? Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give you drugs. You're going to have sex with people when I tell you to. Sometimes I'm going to beat the shit out of you. Sometimes I'm going to tell you I love you. I'm going to manipulate you into thinking that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. But I'm also going to harm you regularly. Like that's not put on the table. So they're really tricked into it, in my opinion. Sometimes what happens is if a woman is in the life long enough, they know, like, right, they know that they're getting into a relationship with somebody that does that. But they're so good at manipulating. These men are so good at manipulating that, like, the choices that a lot of these women have are very different than the choices that I have access to.
That's the other thing too with, if I can interrupt, Amy, that's also that's one of the problems with men's mentality towards prostitution. It's also one of my biggest issues with this legalization argument. You have to look at what got that man or woman, usually a woman, you have to look at what got that woman into that position. I have a daughter, Amy has 2 daughters. Those of you who have daughters or sons, none of us want our kids to wind up doing that for a living. If any of you disagree with me, you wouldn't dare raise your hand right now anyway. But legalizing something basically means we've just chosen as a society to ignore the problems with it, and we're not addressing those problems. If I can I'll get off my soapbox now.
Oh, I like when you get on your soapbox. Another stereotype, and this is kind of an old school one, but like the women who are prostitutes, and I just hate that word so much, but the reason I use it purposefully in training is because I want to make the connection that prostitution is not, like, it almost always is trafficking. So anyway, the kind of old school thought that like prostitutes just like to have a lot of sex, right? For the most part, the women that I work with would be real happy not to ever have to have sex again. Not all of them, right? But they're not doing this because they like to have sex, and they certainly don't want to be having sex with the guys that they're having sex with. They take advantage of unsuspecting men. Like, that's just such a ridiculous stereotype, but that literally was a legislator who asked that in 2015. Like, isn't it true that these women are just taking advantage of? And I believe what he said, he either really said this or I've said it enough in training that it's just now a fact. They're taking advantage of men's fundamental nature. Like, I don't know what that is. Like, the men in my life are really good men. I think their fundamental nature is to be good humans. They make a lot of money in the commercial sex industry. So I will say that they bring in a lot of money, but it's really rare that they get to keep that money and are the stewards of that money themselves, right? But so, like, for a lot of the women that I work with, once they're out of the life and they're trying to, like, be respectable, move on, and heal. So, for example, I had a woman that I worked with who was out of the life. She'd gone to therapy. She was sober. She was doing really well. And she had a job, I think it was like at Walmart. And she was never allowed, her specific kind of trafficking, she was never allowed to look at any of the men who purchased her. And she was working a shift, and a guy came through her line and he was looking funny at her. And she like lost it, triggered a trauma response, left, reached out to me. And basically what she was saying is, like, I have no idea if this is a person who has, like, been inside of me, right? That I had no control over. And, like, oh my God, like, how often could this happen to me? And I'm out there, and, she felt so exposed. And then, like, how am I going to make money? Well, I could go out tonight and make, $300, $500, and I wouldn't have to give it to anybody. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen? I've done it before, right? So for people who sometimes believe that this work is us rescuing people, like, that's not what it is at all. First of all, that's disrespectful, I think, to the adult women that we work with who are intelligent women. But it's nuanced, and expecting that they can just fit right back into mainstream society is naive.
Because of the trauma.
Yeah, because of the trauma and the shame, quite frankly. Like, the way people view women who have been in the life is awful. It's one of the most unjust, I'm going to get on my soapbox, because it is one of the most unjust things. Like, it just makes me crazy. So the women that I work with have been victimized. They have been hurt, they have been beaten, they have been raped. And our society adds insult to that, right? Like, people judge them, people talk shit about them. Like, it's so unacceptable. And I get that it's a cultural thing and that people don't know, but it's awful. And it's one of the worst things that they have to deal with. They're really clear that they're never going to be normal, right? Like, most of them feel like they're never going to fit in. They're never going to be. I think one of the reasons why I do this work is because I have a criminal history. It was a really long time ago. Everybody is, like, safe. I'm, like, rehabilitated formally. But I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to think that I'm never going to be somebody that people could accept. And there's something healing, I think, for women to be working with somebody who gets it on that level. So anyway, I'm totally off topic, kind of.
So I actually, if I can add to your off topic conversation, I talked about how men's mentality toward these things is so wrong. That's something I think women need to look at too, their attitudes toward women who have engaged in or are engaging in prostitution. You don't know what got them there. It wasn't a nice upbringing in a rural neighborhood that got them there. Something got them there, and usually it's some sort of molestation when they were a child, some sort of sexual abuse, terrible home life, drugs, alcohol, that kind of stuff. So it's real easy to be judgy until you sit and talk to these, usually women, and realize that they didn't have the same upbringing that most of us were lucky to have.
Yeah. And hearing Mike say that, like, that is, for the most part, that is the case. But I will say that this could happen to any woman. If somebody gets you at the right point in your life, it could happen to you. Just like how people are like, I would never be, like, nobody could ever beat me. I would never be in a domestically violent. Well, maybe not. It's subtle. So anyway. So how glamorous is it, right? So like pimping has this connotation of like ultra cool, right? So think about the 90s show, like Pimp My Ride, right? So my mission in life is to like fight that narrative. So I'm gonna go back. Bear with me. So the culture that we're in really finds it acceptable, right? Like pimps are, I mean, I don't know that people admire them necessarily, but for sure it's this, like this subculture, right? For Halloween, you could dress up as a trafficker and their victim, right? Like it's just, it needs to be challenged. So the thing about like, can you tell who a pimp is, right? So like pimps, no matter the species, you can always spot them. No, it's for the most part guys who they don't stand out that way. So anything you want to say about that, Mike?
No, they've definitely gotten smarter.
Yeah.
They intentionally don't stand out. Just like the way the like street gangs now, they don't boldly walk around the Bloods and the Crips in blue or red. They'll do little subtle things, but they're smart just like everybody else, and they're trying not to get caught. So if they can just stay below the surface and keep doing what they're doing and make everybody else take all the risks, then that's what they're doing.
Yep. So who's involved? So the trafficker, right? This is sort of my list of what I've seen in North Dakota. So the Romeo pimp, it's just like what it sounds like. It's a person who really presents as a romantic partner, somebody who is like way over the top romantic and like wonderful and it's a seduction, right? For a lot of the women that I work with, what they will tell me is the sex that they had with their trafficker when they first met is like the best sex they've ever had in their life because it's a seduction, it's purposeful. So a rescuer, I think oftentimes we see that with the homeless population. So people who present themselves as somebody who can rescue them from their situation, like no strings attached, and then turns out, yeah, there's strings attached. Sack pimping, so that is like pimping somebody out who is addicted to drugs. Combination of all of the above. It can be a family member. And I think oftentimes that's the hardest thing for people to wrap their head around. And people are really, I'm not saying that we should approve of parents that traffic their child, clearly not, right? But as with everything else, it's complicated. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with generational trauma. It has to do with no good choices, right? If you live in an area that's incredibly impoverished, and if you're gonna get your propane tank filled, and you don't have money, and the person who fills it is willing to have sex with your daughter in exchange for that, that might happen, right? And maybe you had to do that when you were a kid, and so that's just the way it is. I think a mistake that some service providers make when they first start doing this work is thinking that rescuing a kid from that situation is going to feel good to that kid. And that's not necessarily true. We all want to feel like we have something to contribute to our families and to our partners. And if you are 14 years old and you know that what you did helped your family survive the winter, that's a complicated feeling. I know I'm saying that it's complicated a lot because it is complicated. So a buyer, I just say buyer. I don't call him a John. A victim offender. So I hate the expression that is commonly used, and I won't say it. To me, I prefer to say victim offender. So that's somebody who has been victimized, is a victim, but is also now recruiting other girls. And sometimes they're responsible for the discipline of those girls. Although in my experience, oftentimes it's much more like just the recruitment part. This would be another time when Sergeant Bomey and I fought a lot. But I think we are on the same page, which is if you are actively harming people, like that's a line and there's consequences for that. I will tell you that the women I've worked with who have been victim offenders, the hardest thing for them is forgiving themselves. Like that comes a little bit further in their recovery, but that's really difficult, you know, like I think what I want to make sure that I'm relaying to people is that the people that I work with, the women that I work with, are no different than you or I. They're complex human beings who have a soul and a thought, you know, thoughts and spiritual needs and angst that they have to come to terms with. So.
And super intelligent, most of them.
Yeah. Yep. There's been a couple of like, and people like, I get a new client and I'll be like, oh my God, I love her so much. And they're like, yes, you say that about every single client you have. It's like, well, it's true. I do. So who is vulnerable to trafficking? Like to Mike's point, it's people who need love, people who need income, people who want a romantic relationship, people who want to better their circumstance. Like, duh, that's everybody, right? We all have that. Those are human needs. The difference sometimes is that my ability to get those needs met is different than my clients sometimes, right? There's a bunch of questions. Should I read them or?
No, I'm kind of keeping up with those.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. So the specific vulnerabilities of homeless and runaway youth. So when I say runaway, I don't want you to be picturing somebody who runs away to a different city, right? The runaway youth that we work with are like youth who stay in their same community, but they're just like out there. Nobody's taking care of them. Nobody's reporting them to law enforcement that they're on the run. Sometimes they are, but they're basically just kind of living as a quasi-adult. So the average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is anywhere between 12 and 14. And that's sort of like the recruitment path. 300,000 American children are rented for sex every year within the United States. That's a combination of in-person and also pornography. 1.6 million kids run away from home. And 1 in 3 will be approached or recruited by a pimp within 48 hours of leaving home and becoming homeless. So the way I want you to think about that is not like some, like they're waiting at a bus station and some guy rolls up to them and is like recruiting them, right? It's much more subtle than that. And it is connected to drugs quite often, parties, like anything that you'd want to add to that, Mike? Like, what am I missing?
No. Sorry, I'm answering a question here.
Do you want to answer it for the whole group? So people can hear it or no?
Oh, I'm typing, I mean. I'm answering those questions. Sorry.
The question was, what happens to the kids that are pimped out by their family members in the poverty scenario you have? Do they prosecute? And what happens to this child who believes they did something good for their family?
Yeah. Yep. Mike's
Totally wrong. That's what you're going to say.
No, I got distracted by reading everything. Yeah, and so yes. Okay, like I'm super distracted by all the questions because they're really good. So yes, children are often used as hostages. It's so complicated, right? And oftentimes what happens is the pimp looks like he's this person who's got all of his stuff together, and she's the crazy one, right? Like she's the one who can't manage herself. She's addicted to drugs. She's a terrible mother, blah, blah, blah. And then the trafficker and his family maybe step in, and they're great. And like that's a challenge. My personal belief is if we're going to do anything about this, like that cycle, the one with poverty, is that we have to intervene with the whole family. In my experience working with women, with girls who've been trafficked, once I start working with their parent, I hear that their parent has been trafficked as well. And so my approach is not one of judgment. Mine is, I mean, certainly it's wrong and we'll talk about that, but not from, they know it's wrong. Like they don't need me scolding them about that. What they need is somebody who will care for them and see them as a human being so they can work on that and recover. So, soapbox again. So risk factors or common pathways. So unmet needs, right? There's this narrative that the unmet need is this physical need, right? They need a place to stay or they need money. I believe that the unmet need is an emotional need, because if they just needed a place to stay, they would be in our shelter and they wouldn't run from our shelter. They need a sense of belonging. That's what we all need. Being in foster care is a risk factor. A history of physical or sexual abuse is a risk factor. Mental health or substance use, young parenthood, special needs, an arrest history. So why do we identify human trafficking? Like, why does it matter, kind of? And it matters because the intervention is different. It looks different than intervention with, and I've noticed that there's some folks from domestic violence centers here, which I'm really pleased about. It's a different type of intervention and their needs are different. So there is a set of dependencies that are created purposefully by a trafficker that is, it's almost like working with somebody who's been in a cult. Like deprogramming, kind of. So they have multiple sexual assaults, and they really see themselves and their worth as just sort of a body to be used, that's their worth. And I don't know how they wouldn't have that opinion, right? I don't know, like it's hard enough for women. You know, our culture really, emphasis is really placed on what you look like, and your worth is sort of tied up in what you look like and how you dress and how fit you are and all that stuff. It's hard enough when we're not being used as a sort of receptacle for male pleasure. But for women who are, it's really difficult to see themselves as a complicated human being with all sorts of different things going on. They need to have access to services that are human trafficking specific, because there's a lot of judgment and they're really like afraid of judgment. And oftentimes they will talk about what happened to them and people can't stop themselves from having a reaction, and they see it and it reinforces that nobody's going to understand them. And so then like they shut down. they don't identify. Like they don't come forward and be like, oh, please help me, I'm being trafficked, right? That's not at all what it looks like. They've been failed by the system. They have totally been failed by my system, by social workers, over and over again. They've been failed by Mike's system. They've been programmed to fear law enforcement, and that's based on truths, right? Like sometimes they are arrested. I'm going to look at the questions for a hot second.
Yeah, actually, Aubrey, you had a good one. Are youth works in the task force the only 2 local services for individuals who have experienced human trafficking?
No, I would say that the domestic violence shelters, and I think I saw somebody from the family crisis shelter, which is Williston and Watford, if I remember correctly. And I know I saw somebody from DVCC. So the domestic violence shelters are the ones who also provide case management and support to human trafficking victims locally.
There's another question too. I think Mike answered it in the chat, but I'll just relay it. What about people, children or adults, who are coerced to have sex over the phone or via texting? Can this be classified as human trafficking?
Most of those are going to be prosecuted under some sort of manufacture of pornography, or especially if it's a minor, we definitely go, that's a internet crime against children. So we definitely go after those.
Yep. My experience federally is that it's prosecuted as trafficking, depending on, right, like kind of what has happened. I think the thing that, you know, you're going to be so tired of hearing me say that it's complicated, but one of the things that I worked with a young girl who, she was like a street kid from a big city. How she ended up in North Dakota, oh, the oil patch, right? So like she went to go live with a relative there. And she had a history, like all of the historical things, history of childhood sexual abuse, abuse and neglect. And, you know, people had concerns about her behavior. So my personal favorite is when people talk about girls, they don't refer to boys this way, but they definitely refer to girls this way, as that they have sexualized behavior, which most people have sexualized behavior. What they're really saying is that they're having too much sex, right? That they're acting out. And this girl was definitely doing that. And so, you know, I met her, and like within like 2 minutes of meeting her, it's like, okay, you have to meet people where they're at, right? And I actually was meeting her at the Human Service Center in Minot, which is at the mall, which is interesting to me. And she's there with a custodian, and I knew some of her history, and I walked in and I'm like, hey, how are you doing? And then it's like, that's a stupid freaking question, right? Like she's not good. She's pissed, first of all, that she has to meet with me. And so it just got real really fast. And she was talking about what she was doing. So what she was doing was producing porn. So she was like doing masturbation videos, and then men would pay her for that, right? She had a business model, she knew, right? And she was saying to me, like, if I want to masturbate and some old is going to like pay me for that, like, so what? Like, more power to me, basically. Which is sort of tricky because sure, right? Sure, technically she has the right to do that with her body. So where I went with her was, you know, the thing is, research kind of shows that for women who fake orgasms, it's more difficult for them to have them like for real. So then if you just practice faking an orgasm all the time, when you're in a relationship with somebody, it might be more difficult for you to actually achieve an orgasm. And she's like, oh my God, you are so right. I've totally noticed that. It's like, okay, so let's have that conversation. Is this what you want to be doing? Anyway, of course, she was one of my favorite people that I worked with. Okay, I see that question from Kay Thomas. I will read it during the break, and I will like put some thought into it. So, okay, so just know that most victims have experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, rape, substance abuse / misuse, and they do not identify as a victim. They identify as somebody who is breaking the law, and that requires a different approach. Anything you'd want to say about that, Mike? Or have I shocked you into silence with my...
No, we're good.
I don't think I've ever talked in training about that before. Sorry, not sorry. So, what might it look like? The no-brainer is it looks like prostitution. This is what trafficking looks like. It looks like prostitution. It looks like alcohol and drug use. It looks like homelessness, survival sex or couch hopping. Looks like domestic violence or assault charges. Looks like mental illness. It looks like poverty. For those of you who are managing an apartment, it looks like a lot of traffic in and out, right? Almost maybe like drug traffic, which it could be a combination of both. Am I missing anything there, Mike?
Nope, but you do have a great question up there.
Oh, yay.
Do they ever identify as a survivor?
Yes.
We just talked about this.
Do you want to say something about that?
No, we just talked about it. That was good. That's a great question.
So, yes, they do. And I tend to use the word victim when I'm training, because in my mind, if you're in that situation, you are the victim of a crime. You are not a victim in that you're this victim-y person. But yes, many of my clients identify as a survivor of life kind of in general, but also once they have an understanding of what happened to them, they see themselves as a survivor of that. It is the weirdest thing to have this information, right? Like I know what happens, but I don't know that because it happened to me. I know that because of the clients I've worked with. And it's like the same story over and over and over again, but the client doesn't have that big picture. So a lot of what I have to do is sort of translate what's happened to them into that it's not just them and it's not just their situation, and that there's some problems with that relationship. So once they sort of talk to other survivors, once they have the context of what's happened to them, and then they go to the place of they're a survivor. Did I talk about what you said we talked about, Mike?
Yep.
Okay. Because I quite frankly don't remember the conversation you and I had. Sorry.
Must have been real meaningful to you.
I have a lot of conversations. So they have a unique vocabulary, although I will tell you that it's rare. I've met a couple of women who like right out the gate used the vocabulary, but I met with them in the prison setting. And one of them, she's talking to me and she's saying like, I was born in my mama was a home, my dad, and then she like gets this very proper thing and she's like, that's what we call it. I'm like, yes, I understand that. I know I present as a very respectable middle-aged woman, but I understand what you're saying. Oftentimes they'll have a prior conviction for prostitution. They will have connections with other trafficking victims. They might not have any personal items, or they have things that make no sense for their circumstances, right? Like super fancy bags and clothing, suspicious tattoos or other signs of branding. So this is the power and control wheel. For those of you that have gotten any education on domestic violence, you'll have seen this before. This is specific to sex trafficking. It's the same thing, right? It's exerting power and control. It's just that it's done purposefully to make money off of somebody, which is awful, right? Like human trafficking is modern day slavery. It just is. And it's human beings making money off of another human being. And the way that they're doing that is by manipulating somebody's emotions and brain, and it's incredibly destructive.
you think about what kind of I'm going to swear here, and I never swear in training, but what kind of a manipulative piece of shit would sell another human being? It's a modern day slave trader. That's all you're looking at. Amy and I have various disagreements in the past over the Johns, like the buyers and their culpability, and the victim offenders and their sliding scale of culpability. What everybody on the team agrees with is there is no hope in rehabilitation for the pimp, for the seller. I have yet to see one that I thought had any sort of redeemable qualities. They are the worst human beings on the face of the earth.
Yeah, it's a real, I'm just going to say it's a real dilemma for me. And I recognize that I am not neutral on it. I am biased. And I have trauma. I have secondary trauma from working with women that, quite frankly, I love, right? In hearing what's happened to them. And so I'm not objective at all. My calling and my code of ethics as a social worker says I am supposed to like have hope for all. And I am supposed to be able to serve all people. If I would not be able to work with a trafficker at this point. It's just not something I could do. So, and by trafficker, I mean pimp. Like that's a real specific, yeah.
I can tell you, so I've been an investigator for over a decade, and I have literally sat across the table to interview rapists and drug dealers and even murderers. Without exception, every single one of them, almost every single one of them, I could establish some sort of rapport, because that's part of police work. That's how you get people to talk to you. I have never once seen, not just myself, but any other investigator sit down with a pimp and be able to establish some sort of rapport to where you're going in your own head. It's not acceptable, but I understand why they did it. There is the level of narcissism with a pimp it's off the charts. And that's why I just don't see any redeemable, it's not worth the effort. I hate to give up on anybody, because that's not how I am as a person, but I just have yet to see one with any redeemable qualities.
I think if I saw somebody who took responsibility, but my experience with them is that they blame everybody. And they blame the victim, quite frankly, like sitting in court when they're being when they've been prosecuted or are being prosecuted, like their focus is on how things have been so unfair to them. And they're just trying to do better. And if they knew that woman was a prostitute, they never would have associated with her. It's just such bullshit. So, but if somebody had said like, oh my God, I understand, like what I did was awful. Like I would totally have hope for that person. And I would want them to get help. It's just, that's not what we see. And when you think about like, how could you retain your humanity and your empathy and sell somebody and profit off of their damage like that? Anyway,
a pimp who shows remorse is a unicorn in our business.
Yeah.
Right now, everybody in the audience is like, all right, enough already. They're horrible.
Okay, so this is this guy's name is Mickey Royal. He's a pimp. He's got a blog, and he teaches new pimps how to be like the best they can be, right? So here's his instructional guide to new pimps. You'll start to dress her, think for her, own her. If you and your victim are sexually active, slow it down. After sex, take her shopping for one item. Hair and or nails is fine. She'll develop a feeling of accomplishment. The shopping after a month will be replaced with cash. Lovemaking turns into raw sex. She'll start to crave the intimacy and be willing to get back into your good graces. After you have broken her spirit, she has no sense of self-value. Now, pimp, put a price tag on the item you have manufactured. So it's just kind of chilling to me. And it's so purposeful. It's so planned.
It's
So
maniacal.
yeah, yeah. And it's the opposite of what we would want for human beings, right? We want them to have good self-esteem. We want them to feel like they have agency in their life and can make their own choices. So what this really is about is a trauma bond. So a trauma bond is how these women are controlled and manipulated. So a trauma bond is when these four things are present. The presence of a perceived threat to one's person or psychological survival, and the belief that the abuser would carry out that threat, and the presence of a small kindness from the abuser to the victim, and isolation from perspectives other than those of the abuser, and the perceived inability to escape the situation. When all four of those things are present, it creates a trauma bond. It's not unlike domestic violence, right? Those things are present also with domestic violence victims. The difference is this is a business model. It's how you control somebody so that you can make money. And what that does, that trauma bond, it is like the strongest thing I have ever seen. There's research that shows that it changes people's brain, which I totally believe. So the reality is that they assume all of the control over their victim, psychological, biological, social, economic, and they do it by these different methods, right? By the trauma bond. They keep them in like chronic terror, but it's like intermittent reinforcement almost, right? Like you're not always in terror, but you're sort of always waiting for what is going to happen next. Captivity, and that's not so much like literal physical captivity, it's more of like a concept, right? Like there's no place to go. You are with that person and you're not going anywhere else. Isolation, starvation, like a lot of the women that I work with have been starved. So if I'm working with somebody who's actively in the life, one of the first things I will do is just give them food. That's Mike does the same thing. So I'm not going to go into detail about the terror tactics because I just think I am not interested in traumatizing people. But just know that it's how I always refer to my clients, especially when they're getting medical attention, is that they are torture victims because of the physical abuse that they've suffered. And I think the thing that makes it worse is that it's done purposefully. It's a tactic. Renaming people. So one of the women that I worked with had, like, you wouldn't think that was such a terrible thing, right? But she was born into the life and had been trafficked as she was like child sexual abuse victim, child pornography. And she'd had so many different nicknames that she couldn't remember all of them. And some of them were real triggers for her. So creating dependencies, that is the thing that I want to spend some time talking about. So, and that's done purposefully. So, you know, what you want for your client is for them to be independent, right? My desire for all human beings is that they have autonomy, that they make their own choices, and that they're competent in their own lives, right? So if you are in a relationship with somebody who knowingly, purposefully creates dependencies where you can't make any decisions for yourself, then when you're out of that situation, you don't just magically learn how to make decisions for yourself. In fact, you may have a panic attack if somebody asks you to make a decision for yourself. It feels very like rudderless, like you're just out there, right? That's very difficult for my clients to sort of sustain making decisions for themselves, right? And my God, you think about it as an adult, it's like you make decisions after decision after decision, right? So that's really challenging for them. So this has to do with like who gets arrested. um, it's changing, and I always feel a little self-conscious saying this when Mike is training with me, because I know that's not how they operate, but just because they operate that way doesn't mean that every law enforcement agency operates that way. But for the most part, if there's a prostitution related arrest, historically, like who's arrested, right? It's the female. Which I'm sure there's reason for that. And Mike would make fun of me because I'll get on my feminist soapbox and be like, as men suck. Just kidding. That's not what I think. Because it's the patriarchy. I think it's because of how we view prostitution. You know, that like, it's something that like dirty women do. And those women are kind of, they are less than other women, but the men who buy them are not really less than other men. Like there's men, right? Like there's this like weird cultural thing with that. So anyway.
That study though, like I'd love to see so that 2003 is right when I started in law enforcement. So like that is definitely a reflection of how we used to handle things.
Yep.
But we're 17 years later and things are different now. I'd love to see a new stat on that. Hopefully it's better.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're not the only area that does it right.
I don't think you are, but you certainly are doing it right. So, do people want to take like a quick break? Maybe a 5-minute break? Type in the chat box if you want to, okay? Or if you want to just keep going. Not a bad idea. Yes, please. Yes. Okay. So it's overwhelming that people would like to take a break. Let's come back at, should we say 3 o'clock? Like right at 3?
Yep, that sounds great.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, I think we're gonna get started again. I appreciate everybody coming back, and I appreciate the chats in the chat box, and that this is a really heavy subject, I know. And it's difficult. I always feel kind of bad doing it this way because I know that it's kind of worse maybe than having it in person. Sarah, so I'm going to answer your question at the end. I'm just making notes. The short answer is Melissa Williams, and I will make sure that I get you her contact information. So, so working with survivors really requires an understanding of trauma. And just because you may not be intervening with them from like a therapeutic standpoint or case management or advocacy, it still requires, and it, like, if I could wave a magic wand, everybody in North Dakota would be trained in trauma interventions, because I just think there's so many people that have trauma, and it really presents as behavior, like bad behavior, quite frankly. And it's challenging how trauma presents. So trauma initiates a biologically driven response. So what that means is we do not have control over our biological driven response. For example, I have one client who has extensive medical trauma at the hand of her pimps, plural. And when she has to go see a doctor, what would happen is she wouldn't, for probably 2 years that I worked with her, at least a year, every time she had a doctor's appointment, and we worked really hard to get her in to see a doctor, and then the day of, she couldn't do it, right? And finally, she got to a place where she could tell me that when she would get in the car on her way to go there, she would lose control of her bladder and her bowels because her trauma was such. So we came up with some solutions. One of is that she wore an adult diaper, to be real honest. And then she also got some what's called PRN, like anxiety meds, which kind of helped until she could get herself into a trauma therapist. But that took a long time. Trust me, if she could control that biological response, she would have. The other thing to know is that it affects people differently. I have clients who have the exact, not exact same, but very similar experiences, but how it affects them is very different. Like, I have one client who has experienced intense trauma, but she's really functional. And basically what she has said to me is like, just give me tools, like give me tools to know how to say no to him. And how do I deal with him when we have kids together? Like, what do I do? Whereas the other person, like, she sleeps in her bathtub because she can't sleep in a bed, and she, she has so much trauma, or her trauma affects her that way. It greatly impacts responses to subsequent stress, and that, like, a lot of just words to just say, like, things that we might not put any thought into, they may have a reaction to because of their trauma. And you can't predict necessarily what that would be. So this is my favorite explanation or definition of trauma. This is from a woman that I worked with in Seattle. Her name is Leslie Brenner. So here's her definition. Trauma is overwhelming stress that exceeds our ability to cope or integrate our emotions connected to an experience. It can be acute, which means like right now. It can be chronic, or it can be complex. It is the harmful interruption of safety, dignity, agency. Agency means control over our own lives, voice in our own world, and belonging, which are fundamental needs of all people, right? And it can be individual, it can be collective, it can be systemic, intergenerational, and historical. So especially for in North Dakota, so Native American individuals have historical trauma. There is research that shows that trauma is carried in our DNA. and it affects, there's a super fascinating study, or yeah, it was a study. It's called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences, if anybody ever wants to look it up. So there's a TED Talk about it. Her name is Nadine Burke Harris, and it's called ACEs, ACES. But basically, our bodies carry our trauma, and we can pass that along to our children, which creates all sorts of health problems. So anyway, so the effect of trauma can vary greatly, right? So a person can either show no reaction, or they may have a really extreme reaction. They may have trouble remembering details or chronology, right? So like, I think about prior to this job, I had occasion to work with people who were refugees. And I remember working specifically with a refugee family who had lived in a camp in, I don't remember where, Africa somewhere. And they lived there for Somalia, I think. And talking to that person, it was really difficult for me to know if it was cultural or if it was her trauma, but she could not tell her story or really anything in a linear fashion. It like jumped all over the place. And that is my experience working with survivors too, oftentimes. They may go back to the life. My experience, almost all of my clients go back into the life. It's not like they meet me and they're like, oh, I've seen the light and I don't ever want to, like, I just want to, like, that's not how it works at all. It's a lengthy process, and I work with people regardless of their circumstances. So if they're in the life, if they're not in the life, I am still their person, and I still want to be somebody who they can reach out to. The client may not like you, like really not like you, or they may really like you and really love you. And in my experience, that's how it goes. I think I've had the experience once of a client not liking me, and that was when I first started, and she was a 14-year-old girl, and I was the worst social worker I have ever been in my life with that girl. And she had a legitimate reason to not like me. I was the shittiest social worker with her. Like, all the stuff I know about being a social worker, like, don't engage in a power struggle, don't, like, I was horrible. And she told me, and she was totally right. So anyway, that's not typically what happens. Typically, like, relationships are reciprocal, right? And people can feel if you care for them. And I genuinely love working with people, and I really like people. And when I meet with them, I like pretty much instantly, and I don't mean fall in love in a creepy way, but like, I have great love for them, and they can feel that. And they are people who, like, everybody wants love. And so the hardest part of my job are those boundaries, right? Like, I have to have really good boundaries, but they're different. Boundaries that I have to have with trafficking victims are very different than the boundaries that I had when I was working with other clients. So one of the reasons it's super dangerous to have your client really, really love you is because it feels really good. And there's been times where, it feeds my ego. Like, nobody can do this work as well as I can, right? Like, which is not true. Like, a lot of people do this work really well, and it's something I have to guard against. So other triggers are like sensory, so smell, sight, sound. Lack of power and control, or like one of my clients, if I would ask her to like make a decision or be in control, like that was a trigger for her. She would have a panic attack. Unexpected change, so like chaos could be a trigger, or boredom, right? Like stability and quiet can be a trigger for some of my clients. Feeling threatened or attacked, but be really clear that that can look different, right? It can be somebody who's rude to them. So if somebody is rude to one of my clients in particular, if somebody was rude to her, that felt like that was a trigger, and not just annoying, like nobody likes people to be rude to them, but she felt instantly like she was back being exploited. feeling vulnerable or frightened, like nobody likes that feeling, to be quite honest, but that can trigger a real extreme response. And to be honest, it could be anything. And I don't say this to make people be like paranoid, or like paralyzed by like, well, how the hell am I supposed to know? Our journey with our client really is so that they have an understanding of what their triggers are. And like help them know that that's normal. A lot of what I do is just normalize things for people, right? Because they feel like they're so crazy and they're so unacceptable and like just way out there. And my approach really is like, this is really normal for what you've experienced. Anybody would be feeling this way. This is, to be expected, sort of. So the word trauma itself, I don't tend to tell my clients that they have trauma. It doesn't feel good to be told that you have trauma. I work with a lot of cops, and I believe that just about every cop I've ever worked with has trauma. And it's shocking, but they don't want to talk to me about the fact that they maybe have trauma. In fact, they mostly want to like thunk me on the head when I talk about it. Like, it doesn't feel good to be told that. So here's a trigger that is very specific to applying for housing. Disclosing their name, their address, their phone number, and like not knowing who all gets to see that is super triggering for people. Anytime I have helped people fill out like rental applications or anything where they have to disclose like medical stuff too, like their address, it's like, well, who the hell's going to see this? And how do I know that he's not going to have access to that, right? So answering questions about historical addresses, right? So like, where did you live? What other places have you lived at? Because almost always the rental history is going to be in the client's name, but they didn't make any decisions. So they have really bad rental history because they weren't responsible for it, but everything was in their name, if that makes sense. They're also oftentimes really worried about making mistakes. Like, I just think about like, if you work in a really terrible work environment where you get in trouble all the time for a tiny little mistake, it's like that times 20 when you're being trafficked. Like, your safety depends on you not screwing things up. Like, you have to do things the right way and the way they say you have to do things. So they're really afraid of making mistakes. And when I say they, like, that's a gross generalization, I know that, but overwhelmingly. So why don't they leave? What are some barriers? First of all, oftentimes they're in denial that they're in a situation that's exploitative, right? And our community doesn't think that we have a problem with it. Our community oftentimes thinks if we have trafficking, it looks very dramatic. They don't see it as like the runaway kid who is doing drugs and engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior, right? Like, that's trafficking. Anyway. The trauma bond is one of the biggest reasons why they don't leave. Mental illness, addiction, and social contempt. So, I got on my soapbox about social contempt, but that's us. That's our society. That's making jokes about prostitutes. It's judging women who have sex too much with random, like, it is our whole culture. And I'm not super fun when people make jokes. Like, it's not funny to me. I'm not saying that I'm not inappropriate. Like, you can't do this work and not find humor in the macabre, if you will, right? But I have a really good friend who's a football coach, and like every once in a while he doesn't anymore, but he would like tell me a joke that's like sexist or like whatever. I'm like, that's not funny. Like, I turn into this like stereotypical feminist who's like, that's not funny. Right? It's not funny. It pisses me off. So another reason or barrier is lack of familial support, right? So like, the family, first of all, they may have burned their bridges with their family, right? Like, they've made so many bad decisions that their family's like, I don't know what to do with you anymore. Like, I love you, but I can't be in this craziness with you anymore. lack of education or work history, and then poverty. There's not great choices when you live in poverty. Another barrier is like inadequate access to safe housing, right? You guys know all about that. I mean, there's a reason why there's a program. They don't trust the police. And we have limited resources for support and healing, right? Like, you can get addiction services, you can get mental health services, but not all addiction services and not all mental health services are trained up in terms of what trafficking looks like. So when we think about what their needs are, I challenge all service providers to be looking at, go deeper than just like, they need a place to stay, they need housing, they need Medicaid, they need blah, blah, blah. They have emotion. The thing that's going to derail all of that is their emotional need and their need for love and belonging. If they're not getting that met, they will sacrifice. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which was done in like 1946. And I'm not saying that that's too old. I'm just saying that we maybe know more now. So his theory is that it's this triangle, right? Like, when we go up the steps. So basically our physiological needs have to be met, and then our safety, and then our need for love and belonging, blah, blah. That's not my experience with trafficking victims. The number one need that they need to get met first is their need for love and belonging. So if we're not addressing that, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's a little dramatic. Of course it matters what we're doing, but it will derail if they don't get that need met. So, and I'm seeing that there's like 12 comments or questions. Mike, are you looking at them? So could you do that for me? If I'm pitiful enough.
Yeah, I've been doing that. Yep. And I think, I don't know, I think I answered Vicky's question. Vicky had a good question. I think I answered it, but you can look at it.
Okay, I'll look when I'm done, and I'm trying to
Okay.
wrap up super quick so we have time for that.
Yeah.
So the first thing that they need is a safe place to go, right? Immediately leaving their situation, most of them are homeless. They need immediate access to person-centered trauma-informed services, right? They need peer support. They need immediate access to drug and alcohol treatment. They need long-term trauma-focused therapy. They need legal assistance. They need job training. Those are all the things they need.
Actually, can you go back to that?
Absolutely.
That slide right there is a big part of it, Vicky, if that answers your question. I love North Dakota. We suck at immediate access to any kind of services. I worked as a narcotics investigator for 8 years. And I can tell you, working with addicts, like, they need immediate access to drug and alcohol treatment too. We just don't have that in North Dakota. There's a waiting list. So we are, that's part of the reason that it's really hard to keep them on track and get them out of that life.
So that is a really good answer. Vicki, I just read that. And first of all, I just want to say I appreciate your empathy and compassion. So I think it does come down to that need for love and belonging. Okay, so I'm in a relationship and I am head over heels in love with the person that I'm with. If somebody told me that he doesn't love me and he's just using me and I need to stay away from him, or if something goes wrong and I have to leave him, it would be the hardest thing I've ever done. And I'm pretty healthy. Okay. My therapist says I'm fine. I do think I'm pretty healthy though. But that relationship is so important to me. And he makes me feel safe and he makes me feel loved and all of that stuff. And that's no different for them. And so like, I'm not going to replace that. Like, my friends would not replace him for me. And I don't have a regular therapist, but like, a counselor is not going to replace that for me. So expecting somebody who has this need to be loved, and they've needed that a long time, and they've never really gotten that in a really healthy way, expecting them to follow through with that is just not, it's not realistic. But our services don't, they're not as creative as I would like them to be. And there's a, you know, oftentimes places have a, like, if you don't show up for appointments, then you're like banned and you have to wait forever to come back, which is just not helpful at all. I
Just
don't know
like,
if that,
just, and we've talked about it before too, just the, like the check-in processes for some of these places makes you never want to ever have to do that again. The paperwork and all the things that you have to do to get into facilities and get services. It's almost prohibitive. And like for somebody who, like me, who hates waiting in line and doing stuff like that, it's terrible.
yeah, well, and like, you know, it's like if you have money, if you're like respectable middle class and you have insurance, then it's relatively easy to get services, right? So like when I jokingly talk about my therapist, or not joking, like I make an appointment and I go see her. If I don't have insurance and I have to go, and I'm not saying anything, it's not about the Human Service Center. I'm not saying that they do a bad job at all. It's just how it's set up. Like I have to go through a humiliating process. I have to talk to 3 or 4 different people. And so like if you're poor, your options just like, you don't have as much dignity. So to my like next point, like what they need is safety and dignity. Like they need to be treated like they have value. Social contempt is real, right? We talked about that probably to death. And they need patience. They need patience from their providers. We don't blame them for behavior that we know is a predictable and understandable result of the trauma that they've had. And we also have to really try to understand the love they have for their exploiter. Like it is really fundamentally disrespectful to tell somebody you can't really love him, you don't really love him, he's bad, he's right. But people do that. Which is not helpful at all. And they need to be working with the right people, right? So like when I first started doing this work, I basically was like begging people, will you take my client? Will you provide blah, 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 blah. I do not do that anymore. It's like, if you're not willing to let me train you, I'm not interested. I would rather, I am picky about who I send my client to. And they need a vision of the future that offers them something they want, right? It's not about what I want for them. It's about what they want, because they have the right to that. So what can our agencies do? We need to look at what processes we have that may be re-traumatizing. Like look at our paperwork. One of the best things I think we did at YouthWorks was have our like receptionists look at all of the paperwork, like fill it out, right? And one of the people that work for us, so one of the questions on one of our intakes, which is mandated by federal funding, is, I think it's the VI SPDAT, and it says something about like, do you engage in risky behavior, i.e. like unprotected sex? And one of our workers was like, well, I suppose when I was raped, I engaged in unprotected, risky sex because he didn't wear a condom. And by the way, I didn't think I would have to think about that when I came to your office. So like looking at what are the things that we're expecting people to just share is really important. And then like rigidity and an assumption about cultural norm, right? Like don't apply what is normal in your life to everybody else. It's really important that we are aware of our attitudes.
Okay, we'll see.
I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But the biggest philosophy I guess I have is that I'm always happy to see them. And most of the time I am. You know, there's times when it's my own shit and I'm tired or I'm like fried or whatever. But for the most part, like I'm happy to see them. I can't remember, I think it was Maya Angelou who said like every child deserves that when they walk in the room, somebody lights up for them, right? That like somebody is excited to see them. And sometimes they don't have that. So I'm the one then, right? So what we've learned is that we have to create a safe space for them, listen more than we talk. We don't make promises. I don't make promises other than I will stick with them no matter what. I also learned the hard way about an awareness of their academic or their educational level, right? Like they might not understand literally what I'm saying. And then normalizing like sadness, craziness, like they'll say like, I'm just broken, I'm crazy. What I usually say to that is like, nah, like anybody would feel that way. Like that's so normal. Of course you feel that way. So, it's about our attitudes too. Like we are always in the room with the client, like who we are as a person. So what are our attitudes about sex in general, right? What about commercial sex? What about drugs? What about profanity, violence, race, the LGBTQ community? And then monitoring your nonverbals, right? So like they'll test you, they'll give you some information that's shocking. And if you react in a supportive way and you're not shocked, then they'll trust you a little bit more, right? And it's not because we need information. I don't need people to give me shocking information. I just want them to know that I'm not going to judge them and it's safe and I'm not grossed out by them. Because honestly, they feel like most people are kind of grossed out by them. So there's some questions that I wrote down that I want to get to. So those questions are, there was one specifically about the LGBTQ community, and for people who are not sort of versed in that, that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. Q, sometimes people say questioning, sometimes people say queer. Yes, they are more at risk for the reasons you listed, which were they're more likely to be looking for approval because oftentimes they're not getting that, and they're more likely to be kicked out. Working, I can just say that as a youth provider. A lot of my clients who are gay or lesbian or bisexual, transgender, they get kicked out by their parents, or something that we call push out, which is, so the expression like, I love you, but I hate the sin, which if you are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, that's not behavior that you have, that's who you are. Just like I am heterosexual, right? I can't separate that from who I am as a person. That's my identity. So being told that that's a sin is really difficult. And then there was a question about what do you do with clients who they've been trafficked, they're not being trafficked anymore, but they're still feeling like they are, or they're still being controlled by that person or watched or whatever. I think just being patient with them and getting some training yourself on even like specific psychiatric training, maybe like, let's sort through what's your trauma, what is really a threat, what's not a threat, but it's tricky. I've done that. Like, I have lots of clients who are there and it's tough for sure. And then in Fargo, if you suspect that your client is being trafficked, it's Melissa Williams. And I will type her email in the chat box. While I'm doing that, if people have other questions or if you want to say something, feel free. It'll just take me a second to look up her email address. Okay, so her email is navigator102@ndhttf.org, which stands for North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force, but I'll type it in too. Does anybody have any questions? We're happy to have you unmute at this point. So I'm hearing that's a no.
Looks like everybody had put them in the chats.
Yeah, thank you. This was really, really, you were a good group. You had lots of good questions and comments, and for whoever said, go ahead.
Thank you, Amy and Mike. We really appreciate you sharing your information. It's really eye-opening for all of us.
You bet. Our pleasure.
And then everybody, please fill out your evaluation forms. And next week's training is on evictions, and that's being provided by Christine Waco. So thank you, Amy and Mike.
Thank you.
You guys.
Thanks, Amy and Mike, so much.
So much. And Amy, you need to see therapists because of what you have to deal with all the time.
Yes, it's true. That's why I do see a therapist every once in a while. Yep. Because like secondary trauma is a real thing, and it like I didn't know how it was affecting me until I couldn't say no, right? Which was not like me. And I couldn't stop working, and I like wouldn't let anybody else do the work, like blah, which is not helpful. So anyway, thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day. I'm going to take off.